Grandparents' Day. I was thinking of my granddad. I don't have any grandparents left. I'm at the vintage where they've long gone. And I was thinking of my granddad. We had a very special connection. I loved him dearly. They lived with us for a period of time, and they've always been close. Every week we would share a meal at their house together as I was growing up, and just loved them dearly, just so good. And my granddad actually passed away while Robin and I were in India. Never got to the funeral, all that sort of stuff. But if he was alive today, he'd be about 106 years old. And it was at his 90th birthday was where we spent the most time together at last season of his life. He died at 91, but we were away at that time. And when people get old, they start to share stories of when they were young. I don't know why. I don't know. People who have suffered dementia, their short-term memory is really bad, but their long-term memory is fantastic. Have you ever noticed that? My granddad didn't have dementia. He was fine all the way until he died. He died of cancer, but he was good all the way through. Nothing wrong with his mind at all. He was sharp. But he would sit, and I remember at his 90th birthday, in fact, we sat and we talked a lot about things of the past. He told me all the things from when he was a young man and all these stories and those sorts of things. And I don't know, maybe it is that old people kind of figure that my body no longer can do the things I want, so I remember the times when it could, type of thing. I don't know, maybe that's the case. But I got to thinking as I was thinking about Grandparents' Day and what to share with you, and just thinking on my own experience with my grandfather, and I don't think it's anything bad that old people share their stories from when they were young. It's kind of really intriguing. Have you ever gone to an old people's home, like an aged care facility, and you sit with people? Fascinating stories. I just don't want my faith to be like that. I just don't want my faith to be a story of what happened when I was young. That was the best I had. That now that I'm old and grey and those sorts of things, I'm saying that right now. I'm not old and grey now. I'm going grey, but I'm not old. But even when I am old and grey, I don't want it to be the case that the stories I have of my faith, of God at work in the miraculous and the supernatural and the powerful and the mighty acts that can't be explained in any other way than Him, I don't want that to be something about, remember back in 2020, what the Lord did then, I want it to be fresh. I want to live to the end until the moment He takes me home. I want it to be something where God is at work powerfully, demonstrating Himself as powerful and revealing His glory all the way until I'm in it. That's kind of how I want to go. See, I don't think the blessings that we desire to pass on from one generation to another are types of blessings that are distant memories of a distant time in our lives. Nor are they the ones we're leaving when we pass from this world, like some sort of estate inheritance or something like that. I believe that the blessing that God is asking us to pass down and through the generations from one to another is the blessing of a lived experience of knowing His glory, of experiencing His manifest presence, of modeling what it looks like to pursue His presence with such joy, such passion and such tenacity that His will would be done through us for our generation, declaring the mighty acts of God. This, I believe, is the blessing that is to be passed on. You see, God is carrying out His purposes throughout the earth through the generation of the righteous. He's still partnering with us, His people, for His kingdom to come. God's plan is that every generation would start to be able to go after the purposes of His kingdom. See, we each need to have a sense of destiny in our heart. We must see ourselves as a part of God's unfolding plan of throughout the ages of time. Not as a separate entity without a past or without a future, but a continuous link of God-filled activity, bringing life from one generation to the next. When you look at the scriptures, you see that each generation has certain responsibilities. And I believe the first of those is this: to discern and to accomplish the will of God for your generation. To discern and accomplish the will of God for your generation. David was a guy like that. In Acts chapter 13, it says, "Now when David had served God's purposes in his own generation, he fell asleep." In other words, he died. It wasn't like he just fell asleep, fulfilled the promises and then went to bed. Like, done. Complete, fulfilled. In his own words, back in Psalm 71, he says this: "Even when I'm old and grey, do not forsake me, my God, until I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all who are to come." So good, right? Can you hear the passion in his voice? Can you hear the desire in his heart? Every generation is responsible for fulfilling God's activities in their time, in their moment in history, if you like. Every generation needs to understand the times that they are living in and discern what God is wanting to do through them. Each generation is also accountable to be able to answer the question, where do I fit in God's bigger picture? All those history lessons are really important. But it's really important so that you're in the present, fulfilling what he's calling you to do now. See, we each have a race to run, a role to play in carrying out God's purposes. And we've got to give ourselves over to passionately discovering that destiny. What is it that he is asking you and I to be a part of now for his glory, for the extension of his kingdom? And there's never a time when we slow down. There's never a time when we shut it off, because we never realize the fullness of entering into your destiny if you shut it down because of lack of failure in one area of life, or at a certain time you go through where you don't pick it up. Take Caleb, for instance. Caleb from the Old Testament. Caleb and Joshua were two of the spies, the 12 that went out under Moses' command into the promised land. This is early on. They've escaped the Egyptians. They're out, and now they're looking. And Joshua and Caleb come back with these stories of just how fantastic this promised land is. Every other of the spies come back with a story of how terrifying it would be, and we could never do it. If you're young and you're listening to me right now, and things didn't go the way you thought they should go, don't give up. The time and the season for you to discern what God's will is for your generation. Don't give up. You see, if Caleb had given up, he never would have entered in 40 years later after that. Because for 40 more years, they wandered the wilderness. Guess who were the only two of their whole generation that made it into the promised land? Caleb and Joshua. If you're older and you're listening to me now, don't look back to what was in disappointment to stop you from entering into what God has for you to fulfill that destiny now. See, either way we can get caught up. If we're young and we fail and we have disappointment, we go, no, it's all gone to heck. 4 years, 40 years becomes wandering around. We give up. God says, no, keep discerning what it is. For 40 more years, Joshua and Caleb kept discerning what it was. So to the point when they did enter the promised land, and Caleb's now a real old dude. He's like probably 85, 90 years old by the time he gets into this place. And here he is standing there, and he says, give me the hill country. You know where those big guys were that we first saw, Joshua, when we went in? Look, we'll take that land. You send me now. I'm walking into the destiny that you've always had for me. And he was the only one of two out of his whole generation that got to see the promises of God fulfilled, because he never gave up. Faithful to accomplish the will of God for his generation and the part that he had to play. He knew he had a race to run and a role to play in carrying out God's purposes of entering into that promised land. And when he was faithful to follow it, he was faithful to follow it through. You see, there's some things that the will of God for every generation, no matter what the specific destiny he's calling you to. This happens at every generation. Every generation is actually called to love God with everything they have and love others. Every single generation is called to be able to declare and demonstrate God's kingdom. And every single generation is to go and make disciples of all nations. Those three things just happen throughout the generation. But what is it that within your generation is unique that God is calling you to rise up and fulfill? With his strength, by his grace. What's he calling you to do? As you go about doing all of those other things, what's he calling you to do? Because I think once we start to move in faithfulness to fulfill what he has for us, to discern and accomplish the will of God for our generation, I think then what he wants us to do is make sure that we've walked in the inheritance of those that have gone before us. We're to rebuild the foundations from past generations. You see, unfortunately, not every generation succeeds in accomplishing God's will for their generation. Unfortunately, some get it wrong and just drop it. Ever watched a relay race? Yeah, probably all of us, right? Sometime or another. You've watched the Olympics, you've seen a relay race, right? Yeah. Maybe at school you can remember them. I don't know, you know. You know, a relay race, they have the baton in their hand and they run, and the idea is, of course, to be the first over the line. It's a race, right? And there's an exchange zone for each runner. For the runner who is currently running with the baton to be able to meet the runner who's about to receive the baton. And this exchange zone is around 20 meters long. And the exchange of that baton has to happen within that space. And the idea, of course, is that the person who is receiving the baton is at full tilt speed ahead, ready to receive from the one who's running as fast as they can. And when they meet, they transition, no time is lost. That's the ideal. Of course, sometimes a baton is dropped. It's then you can go outside your lane, you're allowed to pick it up, but you can't make it progress any further forward from where it came out. You've got to go back into your lane at the spot it went out and then keep running the race. But of course, everyone else by that time has probably gone past. There's a season in all of our lives when some things that we have been involved in need to be passed on to the next generation. The baton needs to be exchanged. As painful as it can be, we're reminded that this race we're in is not just about us. The race we're in is about the story that's gone before us, the runner before us, the one that we will pass it on to in the bigger picture of generation to generation to generation to accomplish the will and the purposes of God for every generation. We've got to learn when it's our time to exchange the baton. You don't want to wait until you're dog-tired and you didn't quite make the exchange. Or drop it. And think, oh, this is too much, I can't keep going. You don't want to be the one who's receiving the baton. Just kind of be like, oh, there's a baton coming? Yeah, the people, the generation that the baton's being passed to have to be at speed so we're ready to run with what's being passed on. And the generation that's passing it on has to realize that their identity is not caught up in the fact that they're holding a baton. It's that they're running a race. Our identity is not in that we hold a baton. It is that we're a part of a race. It's okay to exchange it. It's okay to pass it on. Because as soon as you do, you can cheer on the next baton holder. Sometimes in a kingdom sense, we need to go back and pick up a baton that's been dropped, so we can continue to move forward at pace. Isaiah 58 verse 12 says, your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. Every generation is responsible to reach back and receive an inheritance from those who have gone before them. We did not begin this race. We simply carry it on. We are to build on the truths and the experiences of those who have gone before. Godly people have left us a legacy which we are to build on. We must discover our value, our roots, our heritage, and in a real sense, we actually honor the past by building the future. There's not one culture in the world, not one, where parents don't want their kids to excel beyond them, who will sacrifice and give things up so that their kids can go further. Our ceiling needs to be their floor. Of course, the warning is that there can be a tendency for each generation to fail to listen, learn and honor the one before them, or in fact that the older generation sometimes holds the one back that's coming through. See, we need to appreciate the values and the vision that is shared amongst the generations, and instead of focusing on the appearances and the cultural differences that often come with a new generation, or a new generation that's from the previous one, we need to celebrate and pass on. We've all either heard or done it. You know, an older person looking and saying, I tell you, I felt like an older person last night. I was watching the AFL Grand Final. Well done to Richmond. Sorry, Cat supporters. But I'm looking at the haircuts on the field. Oh my. I don't know whether it's just footballers or whether it's Melbourne. Someone help me out, you know. But I am, hairdressers. It's not COVID. You reckon they're doing their own. Like, let's go the mullet. Let's shave it all off. I felt old because I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, oh my goodness. Look at the youth of today. It's no wonder society's in trouble with a haircut like that. And sometimes the younger people, you know what they say? Those old people have no idea. Seriously, how could anyone with a comb over know something about anything? Then, of course, they sit down together around the family album, don't they? And all of a sudden, the older person realizes that they're sporting that haircut 30 or 40 years ago. And the next generation, they look and they go, hey, yo, I got new respect for you, Pops. That was pretty awesome. There takes a mutual respect for the generations. We honor the past by building the future. We ensure that to rebuild the foundations of past generations, we pick the baton up and we keep moving it forward. And I believe the third thing that every generation must do is to pass on a truth and authentic spiritual life to the next generation. And I probably think that's the most important thing. Psalm 145 says this, I love it. It says, let each generation tell its children of your mighty acts. Let them proclaim your power. I will meditate on your majestic, glorious splendor and your wonderful miracles. Your awe-inspiring deeds will be on every tongue. I will proclaim your greatness. Each generation is responsible to pass on God's purposes and to bless the next generation, to pass on truth and authentic spiritual life to the next generation and guide them into a personal experience of God. God requires us to leave a heritage and an inheritance for those who will follow after us. And it's not just a building. That other person who was alongside Caleb was Joshua. He was a fantastic leader. He really was. Joshua had taken the baton from his mentor Moses, and he ran an incredible race, serving a generation and helping them take possession in the entire promised land. And he motivated his own generation to serve God faithfully all the days of his life. And those who outlived him remembered these wonderful acts. But Joshua failed to do one important task. He failed to pass the baton on to the next generation. It says to us in Judges chapter 2, it says, after Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they were to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things that the Lord had done for Israel. They'd seen the miracles. They'd seen how God had provided. They'd seen what God had done for them and through them and with them. But after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. This isn't just talking about an inheritance of land or some, ritualistic worship. Remember who Joshua was. Can you remember, it tells us in Exodus that Moses would go and meet in the tent of meeting with God. And he would sit and he would talk with God as a man talked with another man. And the cloud, the pillar of cloud that was there would sit at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and all the Israelites would come out the front and they would look and they'd go, okay, God's having a chat with Moses. This is really cool. Guess who Moses invited in with him? Joshua. Let me read it to you. It says, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp. He'd return to go about the business of leading the people of Israel. But listen to what his young aide Joshua, the son of Nun, did not leave the tent. From an early time, Moses had made the invitation to bring Joshua into the presence of God, where he became so enamored with the glory, so enamored with his presence that he didn't want to leave. That even as Moses would go back to lead the people, he would stay in the tent of meeting, he would stay in the glory with the Lord. And that is what established his leadership. He learned to live a presence-centered lifestyle in all that he did, but he failed to take the next generation into the presence with him. He discovered the secret of success in his life, of being fruitful. That was to be presence-centered. But somehow he failed to make the invitation to the next generation. Joshua's failure to pass the presence-centered lifestyle came at a huge cost to the entire nation. As a replacement for Joshua's leadership, God appointed judges to govern and lead the people spiritually as they dispersed throughout the promised land and by all of their tribes. Militarily speaking, they continued to enforce their overtake of the promised land and secured the land, but they turned a blind eye to the encroaching idolatry and interfaith of their marriages that threatened the covenant relationship with God who had sustained them through all of their years. And then you get this terrible cycle that starts. And they slip into disobedience and they don't listen to God. And then they get oppression from their enemies in the promised land. And then they cry out to God for help and they repent and He comes and helps them. And sets them free and at liberty again until they become lazy and do the same thing all over again. And the cycle goes generation after generation after generation. I've heard the book of Judges described like this. When the people of God are not told the works of God, when they don't see a demonstration of the glory of God, they lose the wonder of God, and everyone does what is right in his or her own eyes. Failing to verbalize the manifest glory of God, the grandkids lost their wonder of God. The true blessing we pass on in the next generation is one where we help invite them into the presence. Where we sit in places like we were in tonight. And we say, come, this isn't just some ritual. This isn't just some service that you just rock up to on a Sunday night. We're coming into God's presence. And we make the invitation to the next generation to come, but we don't just make the invitation and say, you'd be better going to church, you should be on your way. We go and we demonstrate what it looks like to be in His presence. We live a life that is completely enamored with His presence Himself. No matter how old we are, whether we're grey, we call out like David and we say, I will proclaim your mighty acts to the next generation until they too can see it. And they're enamored with your presence, because then they'll actually get it. I spoke to a lady after the church service this morning, and she's now in her 80s, late mid-80s. And she said, I've been at church since I was a kid. And said, I've been at this church 8 years. And it wasn't until 8 years ago that I realized that it's actually an encounter with God that makes all the difference. She had every bit of knowledge stacked away up here, and it never dropped down to here. But when it does, that makes all the difference. When it does, that's what actually allows us to pass something on, a blessing to the next generation. Where not only does the glory of the Lord become our fixation, determines every decision that we make, we find ways of inviting the next generation into that place also. And it's through this type of heart, a heart of a worshiper, one who beholds the glory of God, that Lord does great things through. And when He becomes the blessing then to the next generation who are captured by His glory. The responsibility then becomes that we live our lives in such a way that this isn't ancient history. These aren't the stories we tell when we're old about what it was like when we were young. These are the experiences that every generation becomes an eyewitness to through us. If you don't have a recent testimony to tell your kids, to tell your grandkids, to reach out to your own generation with, don't expect their hearts to be captured by our God. Worst of all is when you don't have a story of the glory of God to even share. Take them into his presence. Declare to them the greatness and let them experience his glory. Pass on to them a living example of the magnificent splendor and the miracles that he's done in your life. The God, it's in awe-inspiring acts of power that he's done in and through your life. So here's the challenge. What are you doing to fulfill the promises of each generation? What are you doing to discern and accomplish the will of God? What are you doing to rebuild the foundations, perhaps, of past generations? What are you doing to honor those past generations by building the future? What are you doing to pass on truth and authentic spiritual life to the next generation? You see, there's a critical strategic shift that every church must make. And there's an intergenerational shift where we support, give encouragement, and find wisdom from an older generation who are giving then to the vigor and the passion of a younger generation. To offer up honor, respect, and time for an older generation from a younger one. See, this isn't an issue of age preference. Every old person was once a young person. Every young person will one day be an old person. It's a matter of intentionally building the future. And everyone's a part of it. We're one family. Everyone's a part of it. But you've got to know where you are in the exchange. Young people, get ready to run like you've never run before. Because I aim to pass a baton on where I'll be moving at light speed. So you better get ready. You better do what you need to do when it's time for me to pass that baton on. And I'll cheer you all the way. Because the baton's not in my identity, is not holding the baton. My identity is being part of the race. The race I run is for the King. My identity is in him. Older people, if you haven't passed it on yet, maybe you need to be thinking, when is that time? But it might not be. It might not be. There's Caleb's in the room. There's Caleb's in the room who haven't given up on their destiny of achieving and accomplishing for their generation what God always called them out to do. So hang in there. Keep going. But you've got to know. You've got to know where you're at in the race. I'd like to pray a blessing over you. Would that be all right? Would you stand to your feet? You don't have to if you don't want to receive the blessing. No, I didn't mean it like that. Just joking. Because God will pass the blessing on no matter. If you've got a heart that's open, willing to receive. I want to remind us, family, and I know I'm not speaking to the whole congregation here because we've changed so much in the last 3 years alone. When we built this place, a lot of people sowed a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and money into this place because we built it for a generation who are yet to be born. And it's going to be a legacy that we leave. But it'll be a hollow and a shallow legacy if it's empty. It'll also be a hollow and a shallow legacy if it's full, but the presence isn't here. And that is up to God and how we partner out of our desire with him to be a generation who are looking to see what it is that He has called us to accomplish at this season, this moment, in this time that we live in the bigger picture of the race that we run. It's about passing on a spiritual truth and experience of God's glory and inviting the next generation in. It's about ensuring we go back and we stand on the inheritance and we rebuild that foundation from our past to ensure we stand on a firm foundation as we move forward. Let me pray for you. Father, would you bless us, God? And not so we can stand here and say, oh, look, I'm carrying a baton. But that we will all be able to say we have our part to play, our race to run, because in your bigger picture, it's all about you. It's all about your glory. It's all about your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So bless us not for our sake, but yours. Bless us that we be people who are blessed to bless others. That we would stand out amongst the culture that we live in, because we would have our radical pursuit with you and the invitation of the next generation to come and join us in that radical pursuit of you. We understand that this might cost us. But God, we want it because we want you. You're the one that changes hearts. You're the one that mends wounds. You're the one that changes lives. And God, would you forgive us? Forgive me, Lord. Forgive maybe my generation who hasn't honored the one that is ahead as well as I should have. Hasn't spent enough time listening to the wisdom, engaging them in their heart. Would you forgive us, God, if we've been those who have been just not pursuing you, and we're caught at the exchange zone ready, and we're not ready to receive a baton. Lord, forgive us. Get us going, get us ready so that we might be at pace to receive that which is going to be passed on. Bless, God, the generations from oldest to youngest that stand before you now. May your favor, your blessing, and your goodness be with us forever. Lift up your countenance upon us. Give us your peace. Prosper us and bless us intergenerationally, Lord. That as a family true to its name, we would stand by one another, for one another. But we would remember that you go before us. You are behind us. You are in us. You are for us. Bless, 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 so that generation after generation after generation would be blessed. Let us be faithful to your calling and to your cause, we pray in Jesus' name.